This is Earthly Possessions. It's a not a catchy name for this series. It just was what was there, and sometimes it's suffice. It's sufficient. Um, I want to do a couple things today as we begin this series. I want to talk just a little bit about how we got here, why we're talking about this, maybe why some of you are here. If some of you are curious, this will all be recorded. So if you want to go back and listen to it again, or someone wants to join it and says, "Oh, I don't want to join in the middle." Again, these are all recorded. I think we're going to need to do 6 weeks. Uh, I know that seems shocking, perhaps, but I think, but even as I got into today, even as I prepared for today, and this isn't all about today, I'm going to go through a couple. I want to make whatever I have available. I want to make available to you if this is a topic that interests you. Many of these books I've read, some of these I haven't, some of these I'm going to, but I want to make them available, and there are different stages of the process. So I'm going to go through that. It'll do quick. And so those of you at home, you could write, if there's something there, you can obviously order it because you're not obviously here. You're welcome. But before we do that, um, uh, I want to just sort of stage the next 6 weeks, and the way I kind of envision it, and really that just kind of I got up to 5 weeks, and I was like, well, I might as well just go six, and we'll stretch it out because there's actually lots of room. And so what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at uh, historically the relationship that humanity has had with things outside of themselves, meaning objects. And we're going to go back to, way back to a Neanderthal period of if there was one, and where that develops. And you're going to have, and if you're an early Earth person, you're probably going to reject a lot of what I have to say. That's okay. It's going to be looked at from 65,000 years ago. There were Neanderthal people that were functioning. There was some evolution of a primate. I'm okay with that. And for those of you who've heard my theories around the way humanity and the sons of God intermingle, you probably understand that. For those of you who don't, I'm happy to answer questions. But because where the Bible picks up the story is already at a certain point of settling. And what we're challenged by that is that we have Adam and Eve, we have this image of Adam and Eve. God makes the garden. They get one 24-hour period in the garden of cruising around, walking around, dwelling with God in the cool of the evening. And then all of a sudden the next day the serpent was there. Eve eats, Adam eats. They get booted out. They've only been there a couple of weeks. I mean, but we don't know the time frame or sequence. It could have been, lots of years, thousands of years that Adam and Eve could have dwelled. We don't know how long they dwelled in the garden before they were tempted, when that tree appeared. We don't have a time sequence for that. We also don't have a time sequence between Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And which is challenging because it sounds almost like they got booted out. They were like, well, there's nothing else to do, so they might as well have sex and have a baby, and and then they get Cain and Abel, and then Cain and Abel turn against one another. But we're going to look at that because I think there's something about the whole Cain and Abel piece as well, that plays into all of this as well. So today we'll actually look briefly at the Cain and Abel story. But this whole notion of how we move from our relationship with things in the world and our interaction and our need for things and our desire to avoid pain, and seek out pleasure, avoid labor, seek out rest, is all driven and undergirding this whole conversation that brings us up to a present day period. And I think that just that sense of, as I dug into it, I started writing, I went back to the Neolithic, what's called the Neolithic Revolution, which we'll talk about in a minute, but in short is going back to the point where we moved from being a hunters and gatherers society to an agricultural society. And that was a major shift. And then the next one after that is the Industrial Revolution, when we start to see we moving from working by hand and doing things with tools to machines taking over that role. And I think that we are, quite frankly, at the very crux of one right now with AI. And I think we're at another place where we're going to see a drop in employment. We're going to see huge industries fail. If you're anyone in graphic design in your world or your family, you should immediately tell them to go find another career. There will be no jobs in graphic design moving forward, because I can for $30 a month have an AI machine give me 20,000 different options faster than any human person could construct any of that, and it's ridiculous. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the Neolithic period. We're going to look at our relationship with stuff and how it developed all the way through, and then we're going to come up to really the second, and we'll jump over periods, but then we'll get up into the first and second industrial revolutions and talk just about how relationship with things and the development of things have given us a place that in the last century we have not only seen a spike in population that is unprecedented. We've created
So, you
systems
want
and
me to move
societies,
that?
structure that allow us that allow us to actually have those lives. And hold on one second here. I'm just gonna mute you all at home. If you want to talk, go ahead and just unmute and ask a question and wave first. Um, but how we got to a place where we now not just have stuff that we use for utility and pleasure and enjoyment, and as we move through this, we're going to look at all of it, how those affect us. But just the relationship that we have with this stuff has changed. The reliance, the need. We think we're all rugged out here in the mountains. And as I was reading this, I was like, oh, I'm a joke. If everything shut down, we're in trouble. It would have to be breaking out the axe. There's only so much, gas you have in your chainsaw before at some point we can no longer, we're going to be thinking, how do we haul wood out of the slum versus go up there and drive some, bring it back, but use a chopper to split it. So that's today. Next week, we're going to look at the consumption habits of Americans. And in particular, we're going to look at how that influences the church as well. So today we're going to bring us up to this past century, and then we're going to look at how over the last century and really in the present day, what those consumption patterns are. How are we different? Is there a difference? How are we functioning in that role? And I would call these first 2 weeks in a practical theological framework, the descriptive moment. We're asking the question, what is happening? And so the first dive into what is happening is a historical overview. Second dive into what is happening is what is happening in our culture in terms of consumeristic trends. And I'm not going to go, I don't think we need stats, as I found myself going down rabbit holes into stats of different country comparisons for how we spend money. In the end, it's an epidemic to anyone in the Western world, we can grossly say. But we want to look. So the next 2 weeks are descriptive, and then we're going to go and we're going to spend probably a week in the interpretive, which asks why is this happening, and then we're going to go back and we're going to point to different instances, and also not just in a sociological way, but in a theological way. How has the church become a consuming body to the point where we literally use the terms hop and shop for churches? You ever heard that term, hop and shop for churches, when you're bounced from one church to the next? That isn't indicative of a consuming faith, which is actually a name of one of these books. We go and we're seeking out a spirituality, and we're consuming a spirituality that doesn't come out of the practice as an identity of a people, but comes out of the micro identities of individuals who are then seeking out institutions to connect with where they resonate. And this is in the last century, really, it's the first time we've seen that sense of diversity, and we'll talk a little bit about that throughout that. The week after that, the fourth week, we're going to turn to the biblical normative side of that, and we'll look at the relationship, and we're going to talk a little bit about that throughout the whole thing. But we'll look at the relationship that the Bible sort of projects, that Jesus talks about, the framework, what I would call as embodiment. It really taps into, I think, to some extent, embodiment is a term or a school or a field of study that studies what it means to be human and what it means to live and what it means to experience oneself as a physical body. And again, it goes back to that pain pleasure response. We seek out those things. We've talked about dopamine and video, little app games, and cliffhangers at the end of a Netflix show. All of these things are producing dopamine in us. There's even a book somewhere about dopamine. We're a dopamine generation. We're all addicted to it. But that extent of always wanting that, excuse me, in terms of what God has called us to, and because that's a human driven desire for that physical experience of something. And again, there's a balance of not reveling, not overindulging in the pleasures of this world, because that's out of balance, and it's kind of like Augustine's golden mean. It's one or the other side. If you have too much of one thing, not enough food is starvation, too much food is gluttony. There's a balance in the middle, and this is true of everything, moderation. And Ben, I don't want to like you when you sit like that, Ben. I'm going to ask you to scoot back because I can no longer see Roy.
Oh, no, he's
You're,
got to keep his eye on
you're.
it.
So you can scoop if you want to you can scoop back a little, and so I don't want to just Roy to have to look at the back of your head. Sorry.
Okay.
The last 2 weeks, and the last 2 weeks, I really want to take a look at about how we sort of approach the issue, and to that, and these are I bought a couple books that this is called Essentialism, and it really points to sort of it's a philosophy of a way of living life, of saying that you focus on that which is essential, and it takes its expression into the work world. Into life, and that is we spend so much of our time focusing on things that are not important whatsoever, and it's this sort of cyclical effect. We internally know they aren't of value, yet we do them, probably for little rushes of dopamine and other reasons, but we're left with a deeper sense of dissatisfaction in life because our lives don't contribute to something meaningful, whereas essentialism is the idea that if you focus on those things that have meaning or are important, you have a lot more energy because you're stimulated by that. You feel enlivened by that. This was in the literature reviews of all of these sort of cleaning out your stuff. And I don't know anything about this other than this was highly ranked and recommended. Decluttering at the speed of life, winning your never-ending battle with stuff. I have not even opened this, but if anyone wants to look at it before I have a chance to look at it, you're welcome to borrow this. It'll probably be in a couple weeks before I look at it. Also, any of these books, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. This is whatever her name is, Marie Kondo has taken the world by storm. But these are methods, The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning, which I just think is just the best name in the world. It's just right out there. And then actually, these are friends of mine. They wrote a book called A Year Without Purchase that came out from Westminster John Knox, the Presbyterian Publishing Company. They went a year without doing it. It's really interesting. And it's, again, this is more like reality journalism. And this is more geared towards youth ministry, but it does fall into it. It's called Branded, and it's adolescents converting from consumer faith, and it's moving young people away from consumer. This will answer a problem that will be revealed when we get into the interpretive part of it. So what we're going to do is in 2 weeks looking at what the issue is, a week looking at why the issue is happening, a week looking at what should be happening, a normative moment, and then we'll spend the last 2 weeks sort of looking at practical means and what does that actually mean, and we'll talk about that from a practical sense of how do we go about reducing our stuff. And again, what I will say, or not again, but I would say up front, this is not meant to make anyone feel guilty. I was joking when I said this from the pulpit. This was by request. But I do think there is something about it. I know that since I've been here, part of the reason I opened, I have 500 plus board games. That means I could play a different game for a year and a half almost and not ever have to repeat. That's gluttonous in its own right. It's not necessary. Sure, there's something about collections, and there's obviously things that qualify that, and I think there's but at the same time, that was part of the reason I think when I came here, I opened up my game library to the community and said, let's do something with it. Now, does that justify me in my moment of realizing I had too much games to keep those games? Yes, absolutely did. When I got here, I was like, oh, it's for the game library, and I was still buying games. And then there was a point, I don't know, where I stopped buying them, and I think I'm now to a point where I'm just like, I might be done. It's just, there's something, I don't know. Anyway, before I get into that though, what I do want to do is I just want to point out, if anyone, and again, if you all at home, these first few books are sort of things that I think tap into some of the dynamics that will tie into the series. Nickel and Dimed is about poverty in the U.S. and I think this is just to offer an alternative representative. This says not everyone is living in a consumer culture. Some people, the vast majority of their income is basically to sustain life, and they are more akin to most of the rest of human civilization than they do to us right now. Those of us who, I would say anyone who lives in Lake City would fall into the category of having means and having the capacity. We live within, it's a luxury to live here. Starbucks, if you've never read it and you like coffee, fantastic book, History of Starbucks. But how it ties in is the consumption culture. Coffee was a communal experience that then was privatized and then put in a mode of transportation that allowed us to take our own personal coffee experience with us to wherever we go. It's about personalization of drink. It's about personalization of life, and it goes along and feeds into it. But I just grabbed it because I thought it was interesting. If you're interested in ethics around sweatshops, No Logo and Making Sweatshops are both sort of industry standards around slave labor. They're fascinating books. Would recommend them both. Branded is also another popular book. The buying and selling of teenagers does not mean slavery. It's about the idea of selling the image of cool. One of the phenomenons that have happened over the last century, really last 50, 80 years, probably since the 1950s, 60s, I guess, as they started to create, is when culture started being broken into decades, we start to see a new type of branding, a new type of consumerism. There's a constant reinvention. And so what happens, we ran out of stuff. So the current generation we're now is to bring everything back. So I don't know, it was like a year or so ago, you went into, some of the stores in the mall, and it was like I walked into my early 80s life. I was like, are those leg warmers? What's all this neon colors and things? But how and I think it is no longer really just teenagers. I think when this was written, I don't even know. And when this was written, I think it was really a hot topic about how teenagers were this sort of demographic, 2002 of the turn of millennium, how the teenagers were this huge new marketing group, because you see teenagers, the millennial teenagers have more expendable income than more than, we had to earn I had to work at Taco Bell to get my income, and I was making, $3.25 an hour. You would save for stuff. Nowadays, it's just, we'll get into that later. But that I think, though, that over the last 20 years, we have also seen the continual glorification of youth in our culture. And with that has come also being more and more consumed by the value of branding, by the value of appearance, by the value of social presence. And that all ties into the development of the technological age we're in, and social media, and et cetera, et cetera. The last one, for those of you, probably no one other than me, if you've never read anything by David Brooks, he's a great author, but he wrote a book called Bobos in Paradise, which is really about the Gen X generation. And they say we're the generation who were bohemian bourgeoisie. We had capital, but we had we were the reigning class, but we were also, we had the means to buy and create a world, but we had these sort of earthy values, the bohemian values, but we had affluence and able to experience those. If you really want to get into social movements, one of my favorite books from my theological education, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, ties much of what has happened in our capitalistic world to the present day, of how we came through this process in capitalism, and the Protestant work ethic, and the manner in which the Western world has developed has been highly connected to Christian values and Christian ethics. I couldn't recommend this more. If you're interested, you're welcome to that. The next few are just consumerism books about Christian consumerism, consuming faith. All of these, if any of these are of any interest, I'm just telling them. And then Christianity consumerist, yeah. So all of these, and so there's a series of books. In other words, if this is something that interests you, come grab some of these books and read it. The last one is this, and we'll probably draw into this one: The Overspent American: Why We Want What We Don't Need. And I think that speaks to a lot of where we're at today. We end up wanting what we don't need, and we're drawn into it. So, if this is something that interests you, those are some resources you can use for that. So then it comes to the question of, I just wanted to sort of say briefly, as all you know, I just spent 7 weeks cleaning out my mom's house. And this is kind of what got me thinking about the idea, and and really considering the larger development of consumeristic stuff and the capacity. And honestly, as you look at the history, and we'll look at some of this, it's really the development of I would say three things, or maybe with a loose four, which that sort of characterize where we're at. One is the capacity for production. So the raw means, in plastic being something in our last century that has come about, and it's really interesting just to see its growth. Rubber used to be rubber, and then they had a synthetic rubber, and then Gore-Tex, they're developing all these other things. Well, and I didn't even get into it, but there are all sorts of correlations between the rise of all sorts of things in our health lives, from dementia to neurodiversity to autism, to cancer, et cetera, et cetera. All sorts of things that correlate with the last few. So we're living longer, we're living sicker lives, but we have means to treat those sicknesses, so we're still living lives longer, but not necessarily healthier. But what's happened in the last century, that sense of to have that plastic as a consumption point, has allowed us to own more stuff. Financial means, the growth or the inflation, and what we don't think about as consumers is the national debt and the trillions and trillions of dollars. And a term, I have a game, if you ever want to play it, called quantitative easing. For those of you who don't know what quantitative easing is, it's basically just inventing money. I mean, you're putting money into the market. It's a great game too, because you can put as much money as you want into the market, and it just floods the market, but it devalues the actual dollar itself. So we feel like we're spending more, we're making more, we're consuming more. The reality is that our participation in all of this is is a part of that devalue. The reason we're able to do that, the reason we're able to have that luxury, is because we've devalued to the dollar to the point at some point, is when countries go bankrupt and sort of implode upon themselves, and then China takes over. That's the secret plan.
Not to mention all the inflation.
Well, yeah, and it's insane.
You value, you consume, and consumption is greater than supply. You get price hikes and inflation.
Yep. But all of this, and then this all dovetails also with the pursuit of pleasure and leisure. And what was once something for the aristocracy, you think of Downton Abbey, they were the ones who were playing croquet on the lawn, because that's what their day was filled with, because they were charged with the care of a village or whatever it is. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of theories around why Americans like really clean, neat lawns that look like golf courses. Go back to the psychology of the way we viewed viewed mansions on the in palaces and cathedral, these lawns on the English lawn with these well-kept gardens, and it's our own little miniature versions of those things, which tie into to a lot of biblical things in terms of affluence and desire for wealth and materialism in this world. But all that's to say is, I got sidetracked there. Lawns. Go back. I don't remember now.
Downton now.
The leisure, and so we've come into a leisure culture, and to the point where when we start to look at how leisure time and how pleasure time is, how that has changed, it's a century. If we go back a century, we're sort of in between World War I and World War II. I don't know what the exact dates are. I mean, what was World War I ended when?
1914.
So we're in between World War I and World War II right now.
1918. I started in 14.
So affluence wasn't a thing then. Stuff wasn't a thing then. I mean, what we have experienced in the last century is unprecedented in terms of both material production and consumption, to the point that there are lots and lots of resources out there and books out there that address the issue of the idea that we are just a consuming culture. Stuff is our manufacturing, manufacturing stuff is sort of our main industry, and we are the consumers of that industry. Um, so yeah, so let's get into this a little bit. I think it's interesting that, that I was looking at some stats, and we'll get into a little bit more next week. But one of the things that 1.3 trillion dollars they estimate in the U.S. we spend on non-essentials, things that have no relevance in life, and you start to think about how big our debt is. And you start to think about just that sense of the devaluation of the dollar and in that much in a year's time is a lot of money that are spent on extra things that we deem in the moment as being important that maybe in the larger scheme of isn't. And to that end, just a fun fact: there are over 49,000, almost 50,000 self storage complexes in this country alone. Leading to a $39 billion business so that people can store their stuff. So, all right, strap in. We're gonna we're gonna look at a number of things, but we're gonna start sort of. I want to go way back, and when you put this in, what time period you put this in, it's called the Neolithic Revolution, and it goes back like 11,000 years, and to a point where you. It's called the first agricultural revolution. So, for those of you in a short snapshot of how I reconcile evolution, and I hold these things loosely, but how I reconcile evolution is that one, God can create however God wants. I'm not here to dictate how that happens. So whether God snapped, his fingers, or proverbial, or blinked or breathed or thought, something came into being or is developed, and I don't have a problem with either way. I don't have a problem with monkeys developing into Neanderthal people. What I do confess is that at some point God created two humans that were created in God's image and differentiated themselves for the rest of the created order. So for me, some of these things weave in together because I allow for a space for the development of humanity into a Neanderthal people, and therefore in that relationship, you have to imagine, just like more of a primates, there's all sorts of structures and societal and systems that are set up in that species that then develop. And one of actually, I have a book called The Roots of Power, and it traces sort of patriarchy back to primates and how primates operate. And it's really fascinating just to suggest that some of those primordial tendencies still are within humanity today. And I don't have a problem with that either. But the idea behind it is at some point you have the intersection of what of the story of Adam and Eve, and I'll place that around a 6,000 year period, but let's just say some thousands of years period before this, where you had groups of Neanderthal people, and they had to hunt and gather. So they needed to eat. Everyone needs to eat. You would eat what is available. But if you did not know how to cultivate food, once you exhausted the supply of food, so there was something external that you needed, and this was the first basic need that creatures have, is to feed themselves. Because if you don't feed yourselves, you die. So at some point in this hunter and gathering stage, you have people, they have to go to a place where they move from hunting and gathering to cultivating. Hunting and gathering means that you're constantly following animal patterns in the world because you're moving and migrating with the animals that you need to sustain life off of. Because plant life, unless you're cultivating it, is again limited. So you're following the animals. And the thought behind this is actually the humans at that time were actually far more nutrient diverse creatures because they followed from region to region, and the animals went to where the climates were sustainable, and humans then ate those plants in a sustainable way. But there were probably a lot of people who were dying because they didn't know what they were eating, and they were always experimenting. And so this is over time, you have the building of internal knowledge that says these things that we need, we understand. So you move this on into this migration period, and eventually get to the place where humans start to understand these plants are good, these plants are bad. And then they start to understand that they can cultivate. And this is what's called the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, where we move from a hunting and gathering roaming, where we are relying day to day on stuff. And imagine the sort of the Israelites in the wilderness, for that matter. And they move to a more agriculturally sustainable way. So they're moving where water is. They're moving where there is green grass so they can feed livestock. And so what you have is a settling of humanity, a settling of people in regions. Um, and within that settling, you also have the beginning of the domestication of animals in a way that they're not chasing after wild animals as you would imagine, like running around Africa throwing spears at stuff. It was or hunting them out as we do here. It's the more of the cultivation of animals that were more, docile, that were connected. So, and when they did this, they lowered their health because now they're cultivating certain types of things, eating the same things, and you do these little pods all over Europe or all over this sort of center belt where agricultural is sustainable. All of a sudden, you have pods of people who begin to develop region, whatever was in that region, terroir, they would use in their cooking. So a region of Spain is going to be different from Greece, is going to be different from Germany. Is going to, these are all in growing regions, but what is available to them is what sort of, and so they develop then a culture around the very things that they interact with. But it also limits the types of food. But then in the process of limiting their food availability and what they can produce, and that it also it starts to intensify the diversity of the individual's urbanization. The sitting in it. All that's to say is we move to a place from a long period where we have the development of culture, and within that you have a number of things. It's called the Neolithic package. It's kind of what happens when you have people living in a pod or in a group together. You have the development of central administration or politics. Even in a tribal way, someone's the leader. If you have someone's in charge of everyone in that region, and are they the stronger person? Should someone challenge them? Do you like the way someone else leads? And so you have external politics. You have hierarchical ideologies that are developed. As individuals begin to lead, they begin to say, "This is how I think that should be led," and then this is how ideologies are created. You have a depersonalization of knowledge, because now we have to agree on something, and that's not a bad thing. But then we start to agree on how to communicate the ways of doing anything, and we see culture and society develop, and that gives rise to population density, meaning that in order for society to function together with a larger population, you need also the development of division of labor. And the minute you have division of labor, it means that there are those who are producing that they're not necessarily associated with the works of their labor, because they're often producing, and there's a distribution aspect to the larger community. And so again, we're moving into a period now where things that we produce have value to us. Then you get into trade. The idea that we can trade, and you can produce wheat and I'll produce corn, and we can swap some, and you get a bartering system, and then you get a currency system. And so you see, and with all of this, you move from a place where you're just gathering what's out there to a place where you've planted yourself. Now the ownership or property or location matters. The cultivation of culture and food matters. Then you have the development of a population, which leads to the development of production. And that production is then produced for all and is distributed, but it is also traded and has value around it. It leads to the development of non-portable art and architecture. So the development of culture that comes out of that. And again, property ownership is probably one of the things that we think in our country that, I don't know if you've ever seen Eddie Izzard's little Lego creation of, I put a flag in it. It's a spoof on the idea that there was a certain period in history that if you had a flag and you stuck it in the ground, that it was yours. Kind of like when we went to the moon.
Right.
It's ours. I put a flag in it. It's not yours. Yes, it is. Why is it yours? I put a flag in it. So let me pause there for a second, because we're coming out of the Neolithic period, and we're going to then make a jump all the way up to up a little farther. In this period, I think that we enter into the story of where, if I were to put in my time sequence, if I were to follow an evolutionary one and say that God theistically dropped Adam and Eve into a Garden of Eden, into this world, let's just go ahead and say around a 4,000 to 6,000 year period. And that's fine for me. It may not be for you, but it's okay for me. Because I think that that's interesting, because then what you have is when Adam and Eve enter into, because in my sort of convoluted schema of this, there was some bubble world of Eden. and there was a paradise, and there was an indwelling of what the new heaven and the new earth would be in this world, to the extent, and who knows, maybe it was another world and they got transported in here. I don't really know. But there was some sense of it here. And when Adam and Eve fell, I hold on to the idea that they were different spiritual beings. They were different metaphysical beings. And when it says God clothed them with the skins of animal, that God put the skins of animal on them, infleshed us, incarnated us, put us, and as a consequence of being incarnated in this world, death is a part of that, and need is a part of that. And when we were thrust into this world, all of a sudden, our food was not just given to us by trees. The Garden of Eden, you had imagined that is what was portrayed. And imagine if it was like a little dome or a bubble, and you had the rest of the Neanderthal people scrapping around for food and fighting for food, and in a very animalistic way. In the same way apes would, in the same way tigers would, in the same way wolves would. It's the pack mentality. You protect your own. It's self-serving. It's survival. That is in the DNA of humanity. That's why we've survived. It's a part of living in our own DNA, and our understanding of our psychology is we survive. If we were not, we'd all just sort of die off whenever challenges came. But that sense, so Adam and Eve are there, they're picking fruit. Their relationship is not one that there's abundance for all. There's no sense of need of ownership. So they go from this place and they go into the fall and they go out into the world. And I think this is kind of where you have Adam and Eve thrust into a material world, and and then all of a sudden they're in a place where they have to cultivate the land, and they have to figure out how to survive. And in the midst of somewhere in the midst of all of this, because we don't have any really biblical sort of story that says how this evolved. We go from Adam and Eve to a relationship of walking with God in the garden, to a place where the next thing you know, Adam and Eve are having children, and the children are offering sacrifices to God. So they're offering material things that they have in this world to God. One kills one grows one. We don't know how the sacrificial system comes into being. We do know it's present in all sorts of other cultures other than the Judaism, and the question is was it done everywhere? Was it just a sense of, if we didn't know anything and we had this giant burning ball that we call the sun giving us life? There's a sense of maybe that is God in a primitive mind. So the idea of offering something to someone else so that one can survive, but when you go from Adam and Eve to a place where you have no relationship to stuff, because it doesn't belong to you, to a place where you're in the world, and all of a sudden you need stuff. You need to survive. You need food. You need water. And my survival is over and against yours. And by having a larger group around me, my survival is more insured by yours. This is the Mike's right principle. And so if I can survive, it's over and against your survival. And that's what but as you see civilization develop, you see the cultivation of communities, you see a cooperation, you see that develop over time. And as that develops, you see culture develop, you see industries develop, you see the learning of the processing of sheep into wool, of cotton into fabric, and you have and worm threads into silk. And you have this whole process where they start to develop these things. And from around the time where the Neolithic period, where all of these things were coming in, we developed and we settled and we started cultivating land. I think this is where Adam and Eve enter into the picture. And I think you have a boost in some sense of the rationality of humanity, and you start to see a different type of development and acceleration of development. This is why I can see Neolithic people living thousands of years before us, and in the last 6,000 years, we've seen tremendous growth in the development of the human mind and human civilization. And you say, well, what did Adam and Eve, or maybe Cain and Abel, carry the same genetic disposition? I think we're all constantly evolving. We have phones that can reach the other side of the world through beams that we don't even perceive. We have no clue how these things work, but the miracle of what these things do are so far beyond our understanding, and the parts are so smaller than we could possibly imagine. We can't even probably see them clearly because our eyes are all failing. In several thousand years, we've come to these places. And as we have developed this, and I guess the larger picture is, as we develop civilization through this time period, we go to a place where our need and reliance on things outside of us has grown. And there's no perfect picture, there's no perfect place for when it all goes into being. But if you go from a time of Adam and Eve and you enter into the biblical story, you know that there are tools, you know that there are instruments, so they're already in a place where they're using these things. You see the development of precious metals, you see the uses of precious metals, you see architecture, you see the construction of the pyramids around the time of the Egyptians. So you see civilization in its effect. And the idea that there are things outside of ourselves still was not, they were all utilitarian. It was that which you need, because everything came at a cost. If you had a garment that you wore, it was hand woven. If you had tools, they were made by hand. They didn't have inventions, and although over time you have machines and things being made and developed that actually shorten those times, throughout the period of the biblical period, you go all the way up, and they're still chiseling stuff in Solomon's days. Until you get up to the actual last 2,000 years after Christ is when you start to see, and even then, I would say for the first 500 years, it's not like they were doing anything. It's not. I think there are periods of booms in terms of technologies, and we're going to look at some of those. But basically, you go all the way up to the Reformation, and you have obviously amazing architecture that developed in buildings. You have amazing technology, but none of it was. But it was all manual. It was all elemental in the sense of using the elements that were present. You have different ages where they used to learn coppers and metals and met these things. But as they're doing this, it's always an expression of those things outside of us. But at the basis of all of it, it was bound to utilitarianism, what we need to survive, or as we see over the development, in particular over the medieval period and into the up to the time of the Reformation, an emphasis on beauty, as art exploded in the development of architecture. And obviously that always went back in the terms of, you go back to that the development or movement out of that Neolithic period where they were developing statues and things, and to put those, you still had beauty established. And then, but there were periods when those, again, and partly because you all of a sudden had means, you had canvas, you had paints, you had pigments. They came from the Far East, and they came, and you had access to them. All right, so let's jump ahead into the first Industrial Revolution. And in every industrial revolution, you have four things that increase: population, the standard of living, capitalistic endeavors, and the production of material goods. If you go back to the 1765, you had the invention of extraction of coal and the use of coal for energy. Then in the 1870s, you have the beginning of the second revolution that's defined by gas and the beginning of the use of electric power. By 1969, you have the development of nuclear power, and they suggest that not very much longer after that, you have the development of the internet and technologies around that have produced in capacities to allow us to consume. But if you go back to the very beginning of that, the steam engine, when it was invented and developed, again, something outside of us, technology is associated with that. It sped up the process of doing almost everything. It was very small at first. In the 1760s, they developed textile and fabric industries, and this was a huge boom because it went from doing things by hand to doing things by machine, and the power loom could replace 40 people. Cotton gin, only a little bit longer, replaced 50 people. And each machine replaced 50 people. And so when you have that level of production and that capacity to have resource, all of a sudden you have a lot of stuff to do stuff with, because you're pulling way more raw material out. You're pouring more coal out. You're producing more fabric and textile. You're creating more cotton. The spinning jenny in 1764 allowed them to multiply that production. 1781, you have steam. The steam technologies are moving towards transportation and larger factories. So now you move from these smaller places, you move into a central location, and all of a sudden you have these machines that are producing stuff. So you go from hand to small machines that make it faster locally, to centralized machines that allow people to come to it to make mass quantities of it. And so you have to, again, go from the small little pods all the way in. And then then also the steam also allowed for transportation. And now all of a sudden everything wasn't drawn by horse. We could actually, and you were limited by the power of the horse, and by the roads conditions and all those sort of things. You have the beginning of the steam engine and those sort of things that would move you out. And in all that time, all of a sudden, the capacity to produce more combined with the capacity to transport more allowed us to take the raw materials that were readily available to us at a much faster rate than we were even able to consume. In that time, because of these industries were developing, the stock market also started in 1792. What is that, 3%? I don't know what that means. In 1793, you have the cotton gin developed, and again, lended that stuff. In 1811, how many of you have heard the term Luddite in relationship to technology? Someone who doesn't like technological change or technology, or doesn't like, a smartphone, they say, oh, you're a Luddite. You ever heard that?
Mm-hmm.
It's a term that's out there. Well, Luddites were a group that were from Great Britain, and they did not like the fact that there were machines taking over the jobs that they were doing by hand, and basically went in and broke a bunch of. There was a huge revolt, and they were going in and breaking stuff. In 1824, they developed trade unions. And at that point, that's indicative of the fact that we had factories where they had people working in specified industries to produce things enough that they had to bring about labor laws. And it was a pretty significant point in saying the production of that we have in a culture and around that time, 1926, I think it was, the Erie Canal was opened up. And all of a sudden, in between 24 and 31, I put a line. So I think 18. Sorry, 18.
Yeah.
These are, I'm horrible with these the century. I got a problem. But the Erie Canal opened up. In 1831, they made the mechanical reaper, and it revolutionized the food industry. And then we started to curtail crops that lent themselves towards mass production. And you could go down a whole line of corn and wheat and grains, and how the manner in which our grains are produced are leading to lack of health and who we are, just in terms of monolithic crops. We have one kind of corn, we have very few types of grain, whereas there are dozens of types of corn, there are dozens of beans, there's dozens of grains. But when they mechanized those things, it started to refine those industries of production and make it more efficient. Again, the more food you have, the more part of the reason that population was controlled through the history of human civilization was resources. You could only have as many people as you could, feed. And in hunter and gatherers, which is why they're still in small clusters. Once you get to, once you start to get an agricultural community, you start to see, well, you need more workers to work those, and then it's more mouths to feed, and it's sort of a cycle. But you see growth patterns there.
Jason,
yeah.
Quick question on your timeline there. If you go back a ways, though, you have anything in there about when the first merchandising catalogs came out? Like with Sears, Roebuck, or even before those, but people had no idea all the stuff they could buy, and they were getting the word out to them in a catalog, and they would look through the catalog and they'd go,
printing press.
This would be pretty cool.
This would be
well, and you want to, yes, modern day ones in terms of Sears and but way back when there was the hand drawn ones, and there were
1600s, right?
What's that? The printing press?
printing press.
1444. But it was a long time before that became.
But you got catalogs starting in the 1800s.
Oh, absolutely, you got a catalog, yeah.
And they were you could get this, and they're like, oh.
Well, and that's the thing, is once you tie it all together, when you tie it to transportation means, as transportation increased, the capacity to be able to even send a mailer or to hand a mailer out, that someone could then see what your products were, that then you could deliver or ship and move those things. That's all tied into it's a development. It is. It is. It's creating demand, but it's also taking raw materials. And then when you have the capacity of excess stuff, the people sort of fill in the gap. Because if you don't, because otherwise it's wasted stuff. Because for a long time, until we get into the capitalistic, endeavors of the last century, there was always a limit. You could only grow so much stuff. You could only produce so much stuff. You could produce 100 wagons, but if only 2 people want them, then you're left with 98 piles of, assembled wood. You could grow field and fields of wheat and corn and all these sort of things, but if you didn't eat that in the year, it's going to go rancid. So there were always limits within our culture, and we'll talk about that. This part of what's happened is when we externalized the production, in particular when we started producing our own materials, meaning plastics, we get into a place where now we can produce stuff, it's completely outside of who we are. And as that production then is consumed, the more people are out there to buy it, the more stuff they produce. Anyway, let's get back to where were we and so 1844, telegraph was made. So now there was communications to allow textiles and all these other things to be communicated with in the beginning of moving them, and just an improved communication. In 1944, Charles Goodyear invented vulcanized rubber.
1844.
1840, huge point. And I mean, that was in terms of the Industrial Revolution, that was a major development. And it led ultimately to other developments of rubber type products. 1846, you had the invention of the sewing machine. So now it wasn't just the textiles and the fabrics that were being produced by machines. Now the actual sewing of the machines were being replaced by machines. So on both sides of it. And just a reminder, as we're beginning this day, we're saying you don't need to go into a career of graphic design, because the jobs are going to disappear. In the same way these jobs disappeared, you no longer have people producing the materials or sewing the materials, where, in that industry is largely gone in the Western world. In 1856, the Bessemer process was developed, which is a way to make steel more accessible and more inexpensive, and produced faster. So again, this technology lent itself to that, and that coincides with a decade or so later, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and which is another major point in industrialization, because now you could ship stuff. You get it across the country, raw materials. It wasn't consumeristic products at the time, but it eventually turned into it. But originally it was just raw materials. Let's get raw materials across the country. Let's make it where it's no longer accessible, and you get things. You get wood from the west brought out east, and regions where there is lots of minerals and steel and ore, and you can bring that out west. 1870 is what they considered to be the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it's defined by a huge increase in a century of communication, transportation, and really it was a lot of what had happened to electricity. And just to put that into perspective, Little House on the Prairie is set in 1870 to 1894. So think about how primitive as they moved west, were working, and they had, they were building their log cabins and they were doing these things. That's where we were at this time as the second Industrial Revolution developed. 1876, you have Alexander Bell inventing the telephone, increasing communication. 1879, the first incandescent light bulb was invented. And I think that's fascinating. It was the first street was in Newcastle upon something, I don't remember that, but on Mosley Street, 1879 was the first street to ever be lit up in the history of human civilization, leading to in 1881, the guy who invented this put 1,200 light bulbs in the Savoy Theatre in England, and they lit it up. And they had an internal after-hours show that wasn't lit up by flames. So as I was imagining this, I was just thinking, what a tech, like to be the first to have that many light bulbs to be inside. But what we don't think about often is that invention allowed factories to be running 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
The invention of the light bulb took our production up a massive level, because now all of a sudden we could run factories 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was a major shift in terms of how, as a consequence, in 1891, they developed the first modern electrical station, because they needed places where they were generating electricity so that they could send it out, because more and more people were using lights, because production was happening. They were producing more and more goods. 1863, No, sorry, not, it doesn't say 18, this is 1903. You have the Wright brothers flight, it was in 1907. Or no, sorry, the first flight was in 1903. Um, and that opened the doors to trans continental and transatlantic ultimately transportation, and allowed us to pull things from all over the world beyond shipping. Before it was all by boat. In 1907, you have the first consumer-based bakelite product. Again, that's just over a century ago.
Backlight?
Bakelite. It was the first. It was the first like hard like
Bakelite.
Bakelite or whatever. Is that what you? Is it?
Kind of a plastic.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
Kind of a yeah.
Real hard.
But a very very. It's kind of like melamine. You get the bull. And you get even Legos. If you go back and you see like a 1980 Lego, it's got this like rigidity to it
Mhm.
that these modern day Legos they've taken something. They're using a different formula. They're making the sausage differently. Also in the same year, 1907, color photos came into being. So you start to see the development. Yeah.
I'm just going to say Bakelite because when I first started with IBM in the 1967, a lot of the parts and so on
Yeah.
in early computers and office machines were made with this Bakelite because it could be manufactured and molded
Yeah.
to all kinds of shapes.
But
It
what?
didn't have to be
Yeah.
turned. It
No.
could be
Almost, yeah, injected, molded sort of thing. Well, that you get that, and that allows a lot of things to happen, and that coincides with the first Ford Model T. And so you start to see what things could have been originally had to be fashioned individually by hand or by mold out of by natural resources. Now, all of a sudden, you start to see different production means come about. Fordism came about. So we started to increase capacity by saying, how could we do this if one person focuses on one thing at a time? And this is why McDonald's ended up thriving in the way that it did. They applied Fordism to food industries. If you haven't seen the movie Fordism, Fordism after Henry Ford. Yeah, I mean, if you watch the movie The Founder with Michael Keaton, great movie about the beginning of McDonald's. It's about employing the idea of Fordism onto the food industry, and has shaped so much of the way everything is done in the world, for that matter. You have 1901. I don't know, that date's wrong, but you have a radio developed at the turn of the century, and then in 1914 you have the end of the Second World War. And so you have, obviously, in this period now, you have beginning
First World War.
First World War. 1914, beginning of end. No, when did World War end? World War One end. 18 beginning. I wrote it down. So you have the beginning. So, but leading up to this point, you have all of this industry, you have all of this production, you have all of this, and you also have urbanization. You have the employment, and you have division of labor again with what women are doing in the textile industries, what men are doing in terms of, and what the major change and shift that happens is when you have the war go into effect, you have men going off to war and you have women filling their roles. In fact, there was, and then 1925, by the 1925, it was thought that we were back on track. And we were developing as a nation again before the Depression hit. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said, "The business of America is business. A man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there."
Say that again.
All of it. Business. The business of America is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. So if you take that as a if you take that as a sign of the times and where we were.
Still, you got to remember too that in the early 1900s, there was a lot of child labor too. In the factories in particular. There were kids going to work at 10, 11 years old, putting in 8-hour shifts, or in coal mines. I mean,
and again, every time you have in World War I and World War II, when you have men largely going off to war, you have women filling their roles, and then there are children who are filling other roles. And this is why in the 1920s, Stanley Hall developed the term adolescence. because in the period of the war, you have when you come out of the war, you all of a sudden going into that, you have more agriculture, you have urbanization, kids have jobs. There's been a lot written about how the role of children went from being an asset to a liability in about 50 years. It used to be that children, you had a big family, not for a baseball team, but because you had a agricultural, they were out there if a child could it's Little House on the Prairie.
Sure.
They
But they were
everyone
working at home.
they're
for
working at
family.
home, small clusters. They were working. And you stayed within that community. Well, you move to that. You factor industrialization. Everyone moving to cities because there's work there and there's there's industries there, and then all of a sudden you take the men out and you have people fill these roles, and then the youth fill these roles, and around that turn of the period, and then you have everyone come back and things are starting to settle back. Women go back to their roles, men go back to their roles. The youth now had no role, and it developed this concept of adolescence. The term was 1920. It was coined as adolescence, and it was understood as a moratorium period. And this is where you see the development of public school system and re-emphasis of Sunday school, because all of a sudden we have these young people who are running around and they have nothing to do and they're not educated, and so that was sort of going back to the farmhouse school where you schooled all winter when it was off season, and then the summer you went and worked the fields. Now they had young people year round in urban environments that had no direction, no guidance. So you see the YMCA, you see a lot of youth organizations develop, you see Sunday school have a resurgence in Americas. Or in America, in the United States, and you see the development. The development of public school systems start to come into play, and then the religious education movement took its cues from that. In 1920s, it was interestingly enough, they developed lending policies. And so now for the first time, as they were producing stuff, the reason people didn't have the means to buy stuff. So now they were lending, putting things on payment. There were economic means through which people could acquire things. No longer do they have to save up or deny themselves. They could get something. And that coincides, not maybe surprisingly, that during that period, all of a sudden the stock market in the early 1920s shot up, and it did 4 times. In the decade of the 1920s, the stock market quadrupled in terms of its volume. And then it crashed. In the 1930s Great Depression, you went from 144 billion people in 1929, or in jobs.
144 million.
Let me see if I got this right.
Billion.
Unemployed.
What's
Million.
The population of the world?
8.
4 to 8 billion?
No. This was what was
8.
this?
Was it 8 billion?
Might have been industry. I don't remember what the stat was. I didn't write it down right. I probably did, but I don't remember exactly. It was I put some coding that I don't understand. It says 1.5 million were unemployed, and then by the end of 1930, so 4 years later, 12.6 million people were unemployed, almost, and up to estimates up to 16 million people. Oil production. What's that?
That's why we entered World War II.
Yeah. And oil production was way more oil. So it was a period, obviously, with their oil. And then obviously to come out of that, as the war started, you have the Social Security Act. There was concern about elderly. And I also think this is a period, as I think back to it, where we started to, and I mentioned this when I talk about generational studies, we had a major shift in how we view community during the last century, in the last 100 years. We went from a communal environment of the 1920s and 1930s where there was still scarcity, but as we came out of that in the 1930s mentality of community, what you see is I always use the example of my house in Louisville. It was a 1930s bungalow, huge front porch that was the entire width of the house. And all the houses built in the 1930s had these giant front porches. Well, yes, but the reason, but the breezes aren't better in the front more than they are in the back. The reason they're in the front is because there was a sense of community and being connection. You sit on your porch, you talk to your neighbors. You see over the next 30 years in the 1950s that shift to back patios. And you see smaller front entryways. You see back brick patios. People are entertaining. It leads into the 60s, 70s, where you start to see privacy. You start to see decks and privacy fences develop, and then I always say you get into the 2000s where we've already robbed our country of all the wood that we can bear to live. So when globalization kicked in, we could finally get the wood from the rainforest. That actually, that's when the deck boom came. I think we could get all the wood from other places, but then now we're at a place where we've used all these material things, and now we're at a place where you can, the newest trend is to put a track decking, because we can't get all the stuff, but we can use all the trash that we can produce to. So what you see in that process, though, is from this time of the Great Depression, where the Social Security Act was developed, we started to see a shift in how we lived our lives. You start to see a privatization, and in the architectural example, how they moved from the front to the back, and then put fences up, and it became this sort of insular nature of how we communicate. The yards were divided up, and so you see this massive shift, and you also see the beginning of the way because change was happening so quickly. You see different generational dynamics start to kick in, and the sense of caring for the elderly. You had homes for elderly to go into when they were sick or had problems that you couldn't deal with beyond. But as Shannon and I have my mom in the house, we were saying 100 years ago this was the norm.
Right.
Like you just brought your family into your house. Over the last century, we've seen that farming out. We're having people live longer. We have facilities that can house them, and what we start to see older people being put into homes, and then the development of that became a preference over from after World War II up to the 1980s. You start to see an increase of retirement communities develop, and there are a couple things that are happening there. You have a breakdown of generations. And therefore there's there's thought behind generational studies that when you don't have intergenerational intersection, that there is there's a sense of constantly trying to please one's own sense of self and where you're at in your life, and you don't have that larger perspective, the larger lifespan, and that leads to some sort of a myopic or self-centered focus on life, and that leads to then other means through which we receive good feelings or connection, shopping therapy or consumption therapy, or there's a video that Jim, I haven't watched it, Jim, but it's called Affluenza, and it's the idea that in the last century we have become an affluent culture to the point that it's become a sickness.
We've lost them, and it says low battery.
Oh, well, that's all right. That's just, that's like, thank you.
Well,
That's just
I think it's not just become a sickness. Some of the affluence has become a replacement for God, or a proxy for God. And kind of when you started today, you kind of went through this enumeration of reasons for things, survival and tools, and I'm sure you could redo the list. One of the things I noticed that you left out was for status.
I don't think that comes into play really until the last, not that there wasn't always status, but when material belongings don't divide us, you go back to Little House on the Prairie days. Not to say that someone's house was bigger or, accommodated more was a sense of pride. My house is bigger. Not that that doesn't play into this human psyche, but you have to have stuff that allow people to use that stuff towards status. It's like the star-bellied Sneetches. You're familiar with the star-bellied Sneetches? I'll bring it in weeks to come. It's a Dr. Seuss book where having a star on your belly is the popular thing, and that's where the value is put. But I think that, but the whole notion, going back to what I said about the lawns, what I said about everything that our culture psychologically has been geared towards is not necessarily one-upmanship, but the consumption of stuff. Because it's about value. The more I have, the more expensive stuff I have, the more valuable it is, and the more valuable I am. And we start to associate our value, and that's where a lot of these books get into it's a displaced sense of value rather than understanding oneself through the eyes of God, and then even going a step farther and not saying just a child of God on this earth, but I understand myself as a spiritual being, that my value comes from my spirit beyond who I am in my physical realm, is ultimately where we want to find ourselves, because when we truly find that value, it devalues the other. And I think sometimes it's because we don't necessarily buy into the whole reality of what it means to be a child of God and really embrace that identity, that we form and shape our identity through the things that we have. Well, how else do we have to do it? we'll get not this next week, the week after that, we get into the interpretive part of it. We're going to look at the role of pride and competition. C.S. Lewis talks about competition. It's us again. And the Bible, I mean, in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's, and covetous is a word that traditionally means I want to have it over and against you, but you could also argue that it's some level of jealousy. It's the fact that you have something that I don't want, that I want to at least have it or have more of it than you so that I feel better about myself. And this all goes back into that sense of embodiment of who we are in this world. And we were talking about that a little bit earlier. If we place value in our earthly existence, we are using a valuation system that is not a godly one. The differentiations that we have, the means that we have, the gifts that we have, the talents that we have as Christians when we're called by God into the faith are meant to be used where they've been given to us for stewardship, for the glory of God and for the proclamation of the gospel. And so when we start to understand those things, not as things that allow us to hold ourselves over and against, and this for me, this is one of my biggest problems with the Presbyterian Church right now. We're trying to address issues like racism or sexism or whatever it might be. And it's all about the valuation of the embodiment that we live in our world. If I look at Sharon and say, I'm better than you because I'm a man, I have more value in the world. Now, if we're walking around in the forest and no one else is around and there's a threat to us, I'm going to serve a better value because Gimpy over here can't even go very fast. Just kidding.
It's true.
Anytime you can use the word
That's
Gimpy,
why
you
you
should.
hike and you carry a 22.
Yeah, exactly.
So when the bear comes, I shoot him in the knee and like.
But then that puts,
Right.
but see, then what we'll say is that puts value on you, Al. If you have the weapon, if you have the means of defense, your value increases. And in an earthly sense, when the propagation of the species or survival of the species, whoever can bring, this is in largely part why we through human history have lived in a patriarchal society.
Yeah.
Because survival, but there's a connection between the two, because you can't survive and you can't have a propagation of species without women. But through the threats of the world that surround us, you can't have the survival of women without men. So there is this codependent relationship for the propagation of the species and the will to live. And so anyway, all that's to say is, I realize we're getting close to, we didn't get into the let me just briefly go through because I just want to make it through some of the things and I'll just name them. In 1910, motion pictures, again, that I think that begins, and the reason I pointed that is I think that motion pictures and all the way up to 1912 motorized movie cameras, going up to the 23 where the first television came about, all of those things point towards two things: communication and entertainment. Communication gives rise to the ability to communicate things that we need, or to communicate a sense of kind of what you're talking about, Roy, a perception of that we need things because it defines us. And I think young people, this is why certain brands are important to young people more than others, because just by putting on a shirt that says Nike over, some other brand gives them a sense of self or status. This is why when I was 21 and I was fascinated and I thought that I was cool because I liked Ralph Lauren stuff, I put a polo horse on my ankle. I put a Ralph Lauren, it was before tattoos were in vogue. It was very the beginning of it. I put a little Ralph Lauren polo horse on my left ankle. I wanted a tattoo, and then I got it and it was cool for like a year or two. And then like 5 years, I was like, that's kind of stupid. And then like 10 years after that, I hated it. And I eventually I have it covered up with a Tizé cross, but which is a whole nother story.
Which is really a polo horse. We all know the truth.
No, but here's the thing. Just as a page out of my own book, like the issue that we're dealing with, the consumption is something that I face. So I love, I liked fashion. I got a polo horse on my ankle. I ended up working at a Ralph Lauren outlet, where when I left that outlet, because I had such good deals on it, and basically every penny I spent in my early 20s that while I worked there, I spent on clothing, I had amassed what was about a $12,000 or $25,000 Ralph Lauren wardrobe.
Whoa.
Think
I
it would
had
be worth
$1,000.
selling
I had $1,000 suits. I mean, my duvet was Ralph Lauren. Like, I was so into. But here's the thing, and so I had this on my ankle, and this was part of my process in seminary in my early 30s. I really
So
by
you
that.
did this while you were at Princeton.
What's that?
You did this while you were at Princeton.
I got it covered up while I was there. No. This I was 21. You're talking 94 when I got my tattoo. But by 2003, when I entered seminary, I was so sick of it. I hated it. Like, I hated my tattoo. Hated it was on there. I would wear socks to cover it up. I wouldn't want to ever see it. Because it was a sign of materialism. And it bugged me. And so I started doing all this research around this stuff. And eventually I did have it covered up. But all that's to say is that sense of status, that sense of importance, that sense of it, like, all of that ties into my psychology as a human being. Like, that was a part of my evolution. I'm not saying that I found,
I
you
think
know,
that's just young too, though. I mean,
Well, yeah.
yeah, that's why they cater to the young.
Well, have you gotten
because they're the
over it,
ones
though?
that spend the money.
yeah, I get most of my clothing from Costco now, so
You know, Ralph
there's no
Lauren
there's
has
no
a
status
huge
in that.
ranch in Winnipeg, Colorado. You gotta go see him.
But all that's to say is that you're right. We have used, and we'll get it when we look at in 3 weeks or 2 weeks, we look at the interpretation of what's happening, why it's happening. We'll look into the psychology of creating cool. You go back 50 years ago, there was no 60-year-old adult who cared about being cool.
A 60-year-old? No, I don't think 60-year-olds
No, but-
care about being
They
cool.
Oh,
were-
I
they
think-
were old people.
No. But there are no absolute. If you're suggesting that today is not the case, then that I'll have to claim as being not part of Lake City is in a bubble.
It is somewhat in a bubble in that respect.
Because culture.
I don't care. Like, I
Well,
care
you
when
don't
it's
because
young.
yeah, but that's the thing is that's when I said earlier about how we have a fascination with being young and relevant.
I'm dumb.
Well, you can add that on, but my point in all of that is that all of that is very much a part. I mean, as a 50-year-old, that's still part of the culture that I live in. Oh my gosh, I mean, the status, like houses, like, we do it in different ways. I don't know if you've ever thought about this in terms of economic income. Young people think clothing are important because they can afford clothing to define themselves as being cool or relevant or fluent or having something. And then as you say, well, why do racial ethnic groups put so much emphasis into their cars and they're bouncing up and down because that is a status sign. And why do they?
My little truck?
But I'm saying, but the reason they invest their money into
You're-
cars are because that's the capacity that they can afford to invest their money in. You jump that up into a level of a house. Now all of a sudden you're using your house as a status symbol. And then once you get to the house level, then it's how many houses, it's how many cars, and it just keeps adding up, and it's the more and more. So as long as we get into the psychology of it, what you're talking about, Roy, is why this feeds us. Then we're getting into the psychology of humanity and into theological issues, again, of valuation of embodiment over and against valuation of that which is disembodied, our spirits.
So the fact that we're homeless right now, that puts us really in a good shape.
You're nomadian. You're like back to hunters and
We are.
gatherers. So,
We are.
all right, real quickly before the last few things that I just wanted to point out that happened over the last century were you have people living longer. 1928 penicillin. You could say that started a medical revolution where we just continued to advance, but that saved a lot of lives. You have car radio communication. You have neoprene in the 30s developed, more cancer-causing plastics. You have 1935, the first canned beer. I'm sure that got us into trouble. 37 jet engines, 38 Teflon, 41 first computer. Digital computers came out in 42. 43 synthetic rubber, and I think that's a turning point. Synthetic rubber over vulcanized rubber, because now you're not using, it's not the manipulation of natural resources, it's the manipulation of chemicals and petroleum. And around that time, there was a large amount of it too. 46 microwave, again, convenience. And we'll deal with this in next week as we continue to describe what's happened. Some of these conveniences give rise to more leisure time, which give the rise to more time to do stuff, more stuff we want, and the development of the idea of vacations or weekends, like, vacation time, as if that was a thing 100 years ago. That was something of the wealthy, the affluent, the high wealthy and the affluent had that sort of thing. They vacationed in the Hamptons. They had other places to go.
And how about the notion of retirement?
Oh, and the notion of retirement, which I do think is uniquely, and we'll talk about this again in weeks to come, but I do think is uniquely somewhat of a silent generation boomer phenomenon, because my generation is the rhetoric is more like Ed. I'm going to go out preaching because I don't think will I be able to afford at the age of 65 where our culture, the way we're directed, we're heading. I mean, we said this morning, the millennial generation can't afford houses.
Mhm.
A teacher can't afford a house. So at some point, it's going to run itself. 1949, you have cake mix, huge pivotal point. 57, we went to space. 60, ATM. They started producing ATM machines, making cash convenient at any time of the day. And you start to factor those things in the terms of consumption patterns, accessibility of cash, increase income. Personal computers, 1947 or 74. And then also, I'm dyslexic, you all know that. And then the computer internet and all the way up into the beginning of, and then they believe that we're in the beginning of another revolution in 2017 when AI has come into being. All of that's to say, and we'll get into some of the psychology of it next week, what I hope that you see from this is, as we have developed as a culture, our need in relationship with the things went from survival to increased productivity. And then at some point there was a flip where that increased productivity by human means and by measured means went into production. We have an increase in production. We have an increase of capacity to bring in raw materials. That gives rise to an increase in food. The accessibility of food is what controls population. And population grows, you have more consumers. As we develop into the last century, the accessibility of credit lines, we didn't even get into that, and the epidemic of credit in terms of young people these days is astronomical. But the ability and capacity to consume, even in my own lifetime of the 50 years that I've lived, used to have something lay away at Kmart.
It's not just on the consumer end, commercial credits and the fluidity of capital for commercial enables a production too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And all of this
And
ties
that gets
into
overlooked really
more and more
easily.
stuff. And then we consume this stuff and we start to get into the manufacturing side of which we went to today, even to the point next time you go into the store and you pick up a box of something, think of like Lunchables. Not only is it processed cheese and processed meat that have been processed in a factory that have been cut up and sliced and put with preservatives so they can sit on a shelf for a month, but you have little teeny things that you can peel off. All the production that goes into what's ends up being like 6 ounces of food
Yeah.
are real. And so, and the reason I'm saying that is because when you get into the waste side of our consumerism, you start to get into the philosophical category of objectification. And from a philosophical sense of objectifying that which is outside of ourselves. So now that wrapper that we pull off, or the napkin, or the disposable plate, all of those things are things that have no value. And the more stuff that's out there, the devaluation of something, it's kind of like when you go camping and you have one cup. The value of that cup is huge because you drink from it every meal. When you go back to your house, that mug, outside of its sentimental value, has zero value to you. And so the devaluation of things and the valuation of things are something we're going to talk about next week. Al.
Well, one of the things that changes things as well, if you go back and look, what COVID did in keeping people out of offices and the like, if you follow the commercial real estate market in the large cities, those values have been devalued. They're selling off and being repurposed because people don't want to work in them anymore. The offices is going out and people don't want to come downtown. They're taking huge losses, the guys that lent on those things. And now they're selling them at dirt cheap prices and repurposing them. Just one thing where a little thing like a pandemic can come in and change all of those things. And the other thing, as you were going through the calendar, I was thinking about on that XY axis where you have the knowledge gained by the human species over the last, from almost time immemorial, it goes out almost on the line, just slightly going up. And in the last 100 years, it goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
And over now time, we're developing, we're learning.
He's
things.
doing this.
Yeah, we are learning things now.
Yeah.
Every day, far faster as they are able to do with computers and using AI, other things. But there's inventions are coming along.
Well, I know, and I don't know if you can go any straighter, but what AI is doing for us is the acceleration of knowledge is at a rate that we cannot comprehend. I mean, again, what these phones contain and what we have access
It's
to.
ability to get at the knowledge that's there, as well as synthesize new knowledge.
It is.
You know, and I'm not. I've been. Oh, I don't want to derail the conversation.
Well, we're about to end it. Yeah, we'll end with
AI,
this.
But I mean, it's a.
Oh yeah, save
fascinating-
that. Let's come back to
It's a
that.
fascinating thing. We could do a whole session.
Well, one of
probably
the
on
things
that.
too, knowledge used to be vertical. The boss knew all of this, but with the internet and the like, knowledge is now horizontal. Where kids nowadays go, I don't envy the boss. I don't need it because I have the same information he or she has access
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then
And AI accelerates that.
Yeah.
Right now we're off topic though. And I know the people online are like, okay, he needs to shut this down. We're gonna stop here. Next week we're gonna look at again, we'll look at a little bit more from the last century. Next week we're gonna look at the psychology, like in describing what's happening, the psychology of consumerism. And what we see in our culture and why we consume and why we need more. And again,
Are you gonna explain to me then why young folks like have holes in jeans that are pre-cut?
Oh, and pay $100 for them.
And yet they farm, what's that psychology?
that's it, because at some point, and this
It's
goes,
cool.
it's no, but what it goes to ultimately is some celebrity wore ripped jeans. Someone of not even a celebrity, someone of status wore that someone perceived as of being cool or an image that they want to model after, and they see that and they replicate.
That was kind of like, where's the old Sears iron-on patches?
I know. I know.
You had a hole in your pants, Mom.
All right. Well, that's it for today, folks. We'll see you next week in part 2 of the descriptive of earthly possessions. Have a good night.
You know.
Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
that's sure
Well,
interesting.
the other.
Wait a minute. For